The chessboard sat like a battlefield between two worlds. Ivory and ebony squares gleamed under the amber glow of the crystal chandelier, each piece positioned with surgical precision on the mahogany table. The restaurant had long since closed. Chairs upturned on tables, the scent of extinguished candles mixing with lemon polish, and the faint ghost of expensive wine. But Marcus Thornhill remained, as he often did, alone in the empire he'd built from nothing, moving pawns across a board that cost more than most people earned in a month. He didn't notice her at first. Sarah Brennan moved through the shadows like she belonged to them, her footsteps soundless against the marble floor as she wiped down the last booth in the corner. Her uniform hung slightly loose on her frame, navy blue with a name tag that had lost its shine months ago. She'd learned to make herself invisible here, among the crystal and gold, among men in $1,000 suits who never looked at her face when they ordered. Invisibility was survival. It was safety. But tonight, something pulled her gaze toward that solitary figure at table 7. The billionaire sat with his back straight, fingers hovering over a knight, his brow furrowed in concentration as if he were solving the universe itself. Marcus Thornhill. She'd heard the other waitresses whisper his name with a mixture of reverence and resentment. Tech mogul, venture capitalist. The man who'd turned algorithms into gold and bought this restaurant the way normal people bought coffee. Sarah's hand tightened around the dishcloth. She recognized that position on the board. Rui Lopez opening, Berlin defense. Her father had taught her that variation when she was 7 years old, back when their kitchen table had been their kingdom, and chess had been the language they spoke when words failed them. Before everything fell apart. Before she became invisible. The knight hovered. Marcus was about to make a mistake. Her lips parted, almost forming words. But she caught herself, turned away. Women like her didn't speak to men like him. That was the unwritten rule of places like Thornhill's Reserve, where the chandeliers cost more than her annual salary, and silence was expected from those who served. But the board called to her like an old friend she'd abandoned. Sarah Brennan had become a ghost in her own life. At 28, she carried the kind of exhaustion that settles into bone marrow, the weariness of double shifts and unpaid bills, of dreams deferred so long they'd begun to fossilize. Each night she walked home to a studio apartment in South Boston, where the radiator clanked like a dying animal, and the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television through the plaster. Each morning she woke at 5 to do it all again. The math was simple and cruel. Rent, $1,200. Utilities, $200. Her mother's medication, $340, because Medicare didn't cover everything and the pharmacy didn't accept payment plans for compassion. Groceries, if she was careful, if she bought the dented cans and day-old bread, maybe $150. Her waitressing brought in roughly $2,200 a month when tips were good, which left her treading water in an ocean that kept rising. She'd been treading for 3 years now, ever since the accident. The memory lived in her body like a scar that never quite healed. Her father's pickup truck, the black ice on Route 90, the sound of metal tearing that she heard in her nightmares. He'd survived, barely, but the medical bills had consumed everything. The house in Worcester, her college fund. His chess academy, the small storefront where he'd taught neighborhood kids the Sicilian defense and the importance of thinking 3 moves ahead. Sarah had been in her junior year at Boston University, studying mathematics with a minor in computer science. She'd been good, really good. Her professors had used words like exceptional and prodigious. She'd had scholarship offers, internship opportunities at firms that could have launched her into a different stratosphere. But life doesn't care about potential when someone needs to keep the lights on. She'd dropped out to work, telling herself it was temporary, That was 37 months ago. The academic world had moved on without her, as she'd known it would. Scholarships went to other promising students. Those internships filled with people who could afford to see their dreams through to the end. The chess had been the first thing to go. Not physically. She still owned her father's battered tournament set, the one with the missing black rook they'd replaced with a carved wooden piece that never quite matched. But mentally, emotionally, she'd locked it away in the same chamber of her heart where she'd buried everything else that hurt too much to remember. Chess had been their language, hers and her father's. Playing without him felt like speaking to a ghost. Now she wiped tables and smiled at men who didn't see her. She memorized orders and bit her tongue when hands lingered too long leaving tips. She made herself small, quiet, forgettable. But standing 15 feet from that chessboard, watching Marcus Thornhill's fingers hover over a piece that would cost him the game, something stirred in the locked chambers of her chest. A flutter of recognition. A whisper of the person she used to be, before life had taught her that brilliance didn't matter nearly as much as survival. The knight moved. Wrong square. Sarah closed her eyes and turned toward the kitchen, carrying the weight of silence like a stone. Marcus Thornhill had built an empire on the belief that everything could be reduced to patterns. At 42, he'd accumulated the kind of wealth that insulated him from consequence. His penthouse overlooked Boston Harbor. His cars, plural, cost more than most homes. Forbes had put him at number 37 on their list of self-made billionaires, though the profile had glossed over the venture capital firm his father had seeded with $2 million. Self-made was relative when you started with a safety net woven from gold thread. He'd earned his fortune through algorithmic trading platforms and AI-driven investment software that could predict market movements with unsettling accuracy. Numbers didn't lie. Patterns didn't betray you. People, on the other hand, were messy, emotional, irrational, variables he'd learned to minimize in his carefully constructed world. Chess was his meditation, his intellectual sanctuary. He played against himself most nights after the restaurant closed, working through classical games from memory, analyzing where Fischer or Kasparov might have chosen differently. He was good, genuinely talented, with a USCF rating that hovered around 2100. Strong club player. Not quite master level, but far above average. And that small gap, that unreachable ceiling, gnawed at him in ways he'd never admit. Marcus Thornhill was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Harvard Business School, multiple successful exits, board memberships at companies whose products shaped millions of lives. Yet chess remained the one arena where natural talent mattered more than money, where he couldn't simply acquire mastery through capital or connections. He'd hired coaches, grandmasters who charged $500 an hour, but something essential eluded him. That ineffable quality that separated the very good from the truly exceptional. It frustrated him. So he played alone, in his restaurant, where no one could witness the moments when the board revealed his limitations. Tonight he'd been working through a Morphe game from 1858, trying to understand the American champion's intuitive brilliance. But his mind kept drifting to tomorrow's acquisition meeting, to the startup CEO who'd have to accept his terms or watch her company die. Business was simpler than chess. In business, he always won. He moved his bishop, instantly recognized the blunder, and felt that familiar spike of irritation. The board mocked him with its silent complexity. From somewhere behind him came the soft sound of footsteps, then silence. One of the cleaning staff, probably. They knew better than to interrupt him. He'd bought this establishment specifically because it gave him space to think after hours, away from people who wanted things from him. Marcus reset the board, determined to solve what Paul Morphy had understood instinctively over a century ago. The answer had to be there, hidden in the pattern. Everything was a pattern, if you looked hard enough. He just needed to find it. You play. The words cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Sarah froze, her hand still gripping the spray bottle of table cleaner. She'd been moving toward the supply closet, trying to finish her closing duties without disturbing the man who owned everything around her, including, technically, her livelihood. But he was looking at her now, really looking, and she felt the weight of visibility like a searchlight after years in shadow. "Excuse me?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Marcus gestured toward the board with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. "Chess. You were watching the position. Most people don't even recognize a chessboard from across a room." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same calculating focus he'd given the pieces. "You know the game." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in curiosity. Sarah's pulse quickened. She should demur, apologize for the interruption she hadn't made, retreat into the safety of invisibility. That was the smart play. But something in his tone, that casual assumption of authority, the way he'd said, "You play," like a command rather than an invitation, ignited a spark she'd thought long extinguished. "I used to," she said carefully. "A long time ago." "Sit." Marcus waved toward the chair across from him. Not an invitation, an instruction. "Mr. Thornhill, I really should finish." "The cleaning can wait." He was already resetting the pieces, his movements precise and practiced. "Humor me. It's boring playing against myself, and everyone else I know either doesn't play or plays terribly." His eyes met hers, and there was a challenge in them, something that spoke to his need for validation disguised as generosity. "Unless you'd rather not?" The unspoken threat hung in the air like humidity before a storm. She was staff. He was the owner. This wasn't really a choice, no matter how he framed it. Refusing meant risking the job she couldn't afford to lose, the income that kept her mother's prescriptions filled and the rent paid. But there was something else beneath her fear, a flicker of the person she used to be. The girl who'd played in tournaments, who'd understood the poetry of pawn structures and the violence of tactical combinations. The mathematician who'd seen the board as a universe of infinite possibility. Sarah set down the spray bottle and walked toward the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered herself into the chair, facing the man across 64 squares of destiny. The pieces gleamed under the chandelier light, familiar and foreign all at once. She could feel her father's voice in her memory. "The board doesn't care about money or power, Sarah. Only truth." Marcus turned the board so she had the white pieces. "Ladies first," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's see what you remember." Sarah's hand moved to the king's pawn almost automatically. E4, the king's opening, classical and aggressive. Marcus responded instantly with E5, and they fell into the familiar rhythm of the Italian game, pieces flowing across the board like water finding ancient channels. For the first dozen moves, she played carefully, conservatively. Exactly what he'd expect from a waitress who used to play chess. She saw him relax slightly, his movements growing more confident as he developed his pieces with textbook precision. He was good. She could see that immediately. Strong tactical vision, solid positional understanding. The kind of player who'd studied seriously, who probably belonged to a club, who measured his worth in rating points. But on move 13, something shifted. Marcus had just pushed his knight to F5, attacking her bishop and threatening a fork on her king and rook. It was a clever tactic, the kind of combination that would make most club players pause and recalculate. She watched his lips curve into a subtle smile of anticipation. Sarah moved her queen to H4. The smile faltered. It looked like a defensive move at first glance, protecting against the knight fork. But Marcus stared at the position for 15 seconds, then 30, his brow furrowing as he traced the implications forward. The queen wasn't just defending. It was launching a devastating counterattack on his kingside, threatening checkmate in 3 moves if he took the bishop. And if he didn't take the bishop, she'd sacrifice it anyway, ripping open his king's shelter like tissue paper. He'd walked into a trap so elegant he hadn't seen it coming. "Interesting," he murmured, though his voice had lost its casual confidence. Miguel, the night manager locking up the bar, had drifted closer, drawn by some shift in the air he couldn't quite name. He'd worked at Thornhill's Reserve for 6 years and had never seen the owner look uncertain about anything. But now Marcus sat frozen, calculating, recalculating, searching for the escape hatch that Sarah already knew didn't exist. Marcus moved his king to safety, abandoning the knight, an admission of defeat in miniature. Sarah took the knight with her bishop, and the position transformed. Suddenly her pieces coordinated like a symphony, while his remained scattered and reactive. The predator had become prey. "Where did you say you learned to play?" Marcus asked, his tone careful now, stripped of its earlier condescension. "I didn't say." Sarah moved her rook to the open file, increasing the pressure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands had stopped shaking. The board didn't lie. The board didn't care that she wore a server's uniform or that he wore a watch worth more than her yearly salary. On the board, there was only truth. And right now, the truth was that Marcus Thornhill was losing. Marcus didn't say a word when the first game ended. He simply reset the board, his jaw tight, and gestured for her to choose her color. Sarah took black this time, giving him the advantage of the first move. It didn't matter. She could feel something awakening in her, muscle memory that transcended the physical, a language she'd spoken fluently before life had forced her into silence. By the third game, others had gathered. Miguel stood by the bar, pretending to organize receipts but watching every move. Rachel, the hostess who was supposed to have left an hour ago, lingered by the entrance, her phone hidden behind her purse as she recorded the impossible scene unfolding at table 7. Word spread through text messages to the kitchen staff who hadn't yet left. "You have to see this." And soon there were 8 people forming a loose semicircle around the table, watching a billionaire get systematically dismantled by the woman who'd served him coffee that morning. Marcus won the second game. Barely, through a grinding endgame that took 40 minutes and left sweat beading on his forehead. But Sarah won the third. And the fourth. And the fifth came down to a position so complex that Marcus had to stop and think for 5 full minutes between moves, while Sarah responded within seconds, as if she could see through the board into some deeper geometry of possibility. "Who are you?" Marcus finally asked, his voice low and edged with something between admiration and resentment. "Really?" The question pierced through Sarah's concentration like a knife finding old scar tissue. She was 7 years old, sitting across from her father in their kitchen in Worcester, learning the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. She was 12, winning the Massachusetts Scholastic Championship, while her father watched from the front row with tears in his eyes. She was 16, playing in her first adult tournament, the youngest competitor by a decade, defeating a master-level player who'd underestimated the slight girl with the intense focus and the second-hand chess clock. She was 25, standing in a hospital corridor that smelled of disinfectant and despair, signing papers that transferred her father's chess academy to the bank because the medical bills had consumed everything, even dreams. "I'm nobody," Sarah said quietly, moving her queen. "Check." But her hands betrayed her words. They moved with the confidence of someone who'd once believed they could be great. before the world had taught them that greatness was a luxury reserved for people who didn't have to choose between ambition and survival. Marcus blocked with his rook, but the damage was done. His position was collapsing, walls crumbling under the precision of her attack. She wasn't just beating him, she was teaching him, showing him the difference between someone who'd learned chess and someone who'd lived it. "You're not nobody," Marcus said, studying the board with new eyes. "You play like someone who's had professional training, high-level training." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than arrogance in his expression. Genuine curiosity, perhaps even respect. "What's your rating?" "I don't have one anymore." Sarah moved her bishop, the final piece sliding into position. "Checkmate." The small crowd erupted in whispers and suppressed gasps. Rachel's phone captured it all, the moment a server in a wrinkled uniform defeated one of Boston's most prominent businessmen for the 6th time in a row. The shock on his face, the quiet dignity on hers. Marcus sat back in his chair, staring at the board like it held answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. "Again," he said. "Please." It wasn't a command this time. It was a request from a man who'd just glimpsed something he'd been chasing his entire life. That ineffable quality that separated talent from genius, the thing that couldn't be bought or studied or acquired through sheer determination. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:30 in the morning. She had to be back at 7 for the breakfast shift. But the board sat between them like a bridge between two islands, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this alive. "One more," she agreed, and began setting up the pieces again. The 7th game would become legend. Marcus opened with the Queen's Gambit, the opening favored by champions, and Sarah accepted, taking the pawn with a quiet confidence that should have warned him. For 20 moves they danced across the board, piece trades and positional maneuvering, each probing for weakness in the other's armor. The gathered crowd had swelled to 15. Kitchen staff, bartenders, even the night security guard stood transfixed. Then, on move 23, Sarah did something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. She sacrificed her queen. Not for checkmate, not for any immediate tactical gain. She simply placed her most powerful piece directly in the path of his rook, offering it, surrendering it, in a move that looked like suicide. Marcus stared at the board for 3 full minutes. Every instinct screamed at him to take it, to accept the gift that would give him an overwhelming material advantage. But his hand hovered, trembling. Because somewhere in the labyrinth of his mind he sensed the trap. He just couldn't see it. He took the queen. Sarah's response was immediate, mechanical, inevitable. Her knight moved, then her bishop. Then her remaining rook slid down the board like a guillotine blade, and suddenly Marcus saw it, all of it, the entire sequence she'd calculated 15 moves ago. His king was naked, his pieces scattered and useless, and there was no escape, no defense. No mercy. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and it was destroying him. "Checkmate in 7 moves," Sarah said softly. "You can play them out if you want." Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. He was staring at the board like a man who'd just glimpsed the face of God and found himself wanting. All his wealth, all his success, all his carefully constructed superiority, none of it mattered here. The board had revealed a truth he'd spent his life avoiding. That genius couldn't be purchased. That brilliance existed in places he'd never thought to look. That the woman he'd dismissed as staff possessed a gift that made his accomplishments feel hollow. Someone in the crowd whispered, "She's a master." Marcus knocked over his king in surrender, the piece clattering against the board with the sound of an empire falling. Marcus Thornhill sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the fallen king. When he finally looked up at Sarah, the arrogance had drained from his features, replaced by something raw, something human. "I've been playing chess for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've hired grandmasters to coach me. I've studied thousands of games, and I've never—" His voice caught. "I've never seen anything like what you just did." Sarah felt tears threatening and fought them back. She was exhausted, emotionally stripped bare, standing in the ruins of the walls she'd built around herself. "What happened to you?" Marcus asked, and this time the question carried no condescension, only genuine need to understand. "Someone with your ability doesn't just disappear." So she told him about her father, the accident, the academy they'd lost, the mathematics degree she'd abandoned 3 credits shy of completion, the choice between her future and his survival, a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he pulled out his phone. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "My company has a scholarship program for exceptional talent who've faced hardship. Full tuition, living stipend, flexible schedule for family obligations." He met her eyes. "You'll finish your degree, and if you're interested, I'd like you to consult for our AI division. We need people who see patterns others can't, people who think like you do." "Mr. Thornhill, I can't." "Marcus," he corrected. "And yes, you can. You already did. Tonight you reminded me that brilliance doesn't announce itself with credentials and corner offices. Sometimes it serves coffee and wipes tables and survives in silence." His voice softened. "Let me help you stop surviving and start living again." Sarah thought of her father, still recovering in their small apartment, asking her every week if she'd played chess lately. She thought of the person she'd been before life had broken her, and the person she might still become. "I'd need to keep working part-time," she said carefully, "for my mother's medication." "Done. And your father? Does he still teach?" "Not since we lost the academy." Marcus pulled out a business card, wrote something on the back. "There's an empty retail space I own in Cambridge. Been sitting vacant for 8 months. Rent-free for 2 years if he wants to reopen his school." He slid the card across the table. "Consider it payment for the education you gave me tonight." Sarah picked up the card with shaking hands, hardly daring to believe. "Why?" "Because I've spent my entire life believing I earned everything myself. Tonight you showed me I've been blind." Marcus began carefully placing the chess pieces back in their starting positions, his movements reverent now. "And because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted cleaning tables, no matter how much I needed someone to humble me." For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Brennan allowed herself to imagine a future that looked like more than mere survival. Never let circumstances define your worth. Sarah's story reminds us that your past doesn't determine your future. Your courage does. If this resonated with you, do 3 things. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories, and most importantly, go chase that dream you've been putting off. Your chessboard is waiting. What's your next move?